Hello, everyone. I wanted to welcome you all to today's webinar speaker series provided by the PA Care Partnership in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. Information will be available at the end of today's presentation for those seeking continuing education credits for this webinar or certificate of attendance. This information is also available in the email you received from us. Should have been probably an hour before the start of this presentation. Please note the process for continuing education credits has changed. If you have any questions for our presenter during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A feature, which you will find by running your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom screen. We will get to as many of your questions as we can after the presentation. Today's moderators are Nancy Massey, our social marketing coordinator, Kelsey Leonard, our cultural linguistic competency coordinator, Mark Durgan, the director of the PA Care Partnership, and myself, Jamal Ford, the youth resources coordinator, and we will be monitoring chat, Q&A, and YouTube. Today's speaker is Esther Hilton Castillo, and she is a PhD and project manager at the Immigrant Family Wellness Initiative. Dr. Castillo is a scholar, educator, and a mental health and social justice advocate with expertise in diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. She has nearly 2 decades of work and experience in education as a teacher, a counselor, community advocate, and faculty in various educational settings, including early childhood education, youth programs, adult education, and higher education. Welcome, Dr. Castillo. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay, I'm gonna start. So today the topic is understanding racial trauma in the Asian American population. Understand that for a very long time, race and racism has been framed as a black and white issue in America. I remember teaching race and racism in colleges and also sometimes teaching it in youth programs. And for a very long time, a lot of the literature around racial issues are really much centered on the African-American experience or the Latino experience. And for large part, the Asian experience has been left out. And I think it is during this past year, this sharp increase in the anti-Asian hate, violence has really sparked the public interest and draw attention to the ways in which Asian Americans experience racism. And so today we're going to talk about how Asian Americans experience racial trauma, which I also have to say that to understand racial trauma in the Asian American community is a relatively new thing. For a very long time, we have not really addressed our racial trauma because of a lot of reasons, and we're going to explore that today. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda, and I'm going to start with the Asian American population because we're very diverse. And then we're going to talk about racial trauma. For those of you who are practicing trauma-informed practices, you might have heard of those things. We're going to talk about race and what racism is through a sociological point of view, and how Asian Americans experience racism and racial trauma, and a very, very brief history of anti-Asian racism. And at the end, we're gonna kind of brainstorm and discuss what trauma-informed care would look like for the Asian American community. Next. So who is Asian American? So I want to just ask our participants to guess the estimated number of Asian alone in combination of residents in the United States in 2019. And please feel free to type it in the chat. Absolute number. So we've got 3 million, 4 million, 20 million, 70 million, 8 million. Okay. If you can click on the next part and it will show the answer, is 22.9 million. Anyone who are surprised or not so surprised? What are your reactions? And you can put it in the chat. Next slide, please. So the estimated number of, so usually people say AAPI, so and PI stands for Pacific Islander. So the estimated number of Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander alone is 1.6 million. All right, next. Next. Okay, so Asian Americans recorded the fastest population growth rate among all racial and ethnic groups in the United States between 2000 and 2019. And the Asian population in the US grew from 81% during that, grew 81% during this period of time. And this is not that you can see the discrepancy between the estimated number and the actual number in 2019. The estimated number is actually even lower than the actual number. So Asian Americans is really growing very, very quickly here in the United States. Next slide, please. So who is Asian American, right? We are very diverse. And so I'm just showing the biggest ethnic groups within within the Asian American population. And today we're focusing on Asian American, so we're not specifically talking about Pacific Islander. Okay, so the biggest Asian population in the United States is Chinese. That's 5.2 million, followed by Asian Indian, 4.6 million, Filipino 4.2 million, Vietnamese 2.2, Korean 1.9, Japanese 1.5, and other or unreported. Next. Asian Americans are Asian Americans come from different countries. We have different traditions and ethnic backgrounds. So these are some of the countries that Asian Americans come from. Next. All right, so here's one thing that I think outside of the Asian American population or community that gets misconceptualized a lot or misunderstood a lot is that many people who are non-Asians view us as a monolithic and a very kind of homogeneous group, but we actually come from different countries. We have different histories within that. We have different immigration patterns. We speak different languages, and even like I am myself Chinese American, and even within Chinese American population, there are different dialects. So for example, my husband is also Chinese American, but then he speaks a dialect called Fuchao, and I speak a dialect called Cantonese. So even within the Chinese American population, we are diverse, and let alone other Asian folks who come from all different countries. We practice different religions, different traditions. We celebrate different holidays. We have different New Years. We also have different socioeconomic backgrounds and educational backgrounds. And like I said, a lot of the socioeconomic backgrounds differences and the educational backgrounds differences really stem from the way and the context within which Asian Americans moved to the United States, right? So I can just give you something really simple and superficial, like on the surface. So for example, if you are looking at our Southeast Asian population, those who come from Vietnam or Cambodia, a lot of Vietnamese American and Cambodian Americans here in the United States came here to the United States after the Vietnam War. So many of them came here as refugees, and therefore, in comparison with for example, Chinese Americans who came here at different historical time periods. So you've got the Cantonese who come from Hong Kong and the Taiwanese who come from Taiwan at an earlier period because of the political condition within mainland China. And then you've got more recently, we've got Chinese immigrants coming from mainland China. So really depends on the time period and also the condition of the home countries during the point of immigration. We see different manifestation in terms of social economic backgrounds and the patterns of integration into the United States and educational levels. We really see a lot of differences in these kind of metrics based on history. And you can't really tell from just looking at our face what countries we're from, and yeah, so it's not so I hope if you take away something today is that we can't really make any assumptions just because we see an Asian face. There are a lot of different nuances underneath the surface. So next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about racial trauma next. So some of you might be familiar with this, and so today we're going to tie different pieces together. We're going to tie the piece with race and racism with trauma, so and traumatic stress. And how it is manifested in the Asian American community. So I'm going to talk about trauma now. So trauma is the emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, like a car accident or rape or natural disaster. So usually immediately after the event, shock and denial are very common and typical. Some longer term reactions including unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, and strange relationships or physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. And traumatic stress is a normal reaction to these events. So usually we're talking about an event here, but then people might also experience a traumatic stress by witnessing someone else who are in a highly distressing event, like a friend or family member. And usually with trauma that is based on a one-time event, like a car accident or a family member passing, usually is a one-time event. But with racial trauma is a little bit more complex because racism is a constant state for a lot of people of color in the United States. So so what actually triggered the trauma doesn't really go away entirely. It continue to exist in our everyday life. So it's more intense, it's more complex, it's more chronic. And we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the impacts of racial trauma. And we're going to talk about how Asian Americans specifically experience racial trauma. Next. So we talk about trauma. So what is racial trauma? And sometimes you might hear race-based stress is basically the same thing. So racial trauma refers to the events of danger related to real or perceived experience of racial discrimination. And these include threats of harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events, and witnessing harm to other people of color, and in the case of Asians, witnessing harm to other Asians might be specifically harmful because of the shared identity. And again, these are due to real or perceived racism. And I wanted to highlight the term real or perceived because I know there is a lot of discussion about what counts as racism and what doesn't really count as racism. Unfortunately, for human brain, it can't really tell the difference between what is real or imagined, because for the brain, it is equally, the impact is equal. whether it is real or perceived. Okay, so here I've got a little diagram that shows that the impact is greater than the intention. Sometimes people might say that, well, I don't really mean it, so it doesn't really count. But for those who are on the receiving end, it doesn't really matter if the act is intended or not. It is really the impact that counts. And again, I talked about that before we started the webinar, that I think a lot of this diversity inclusion training, the goal is really should be, at least the goal really should be to mitigate harm and to minimize any trauma instead of focusing on what is the right thing to say, what is the wrong thing to say. And I think, and I don't think it is true that all of us have biases and prejudice. And I can talk a little bit more through a sociological point of view why we all have biases and prejudice. Mostly because we are all social beings. We're shaped by those around us. We're shaped by our social environment that includes the media, our political context, our cultural context. So if we and our historical context. So none of us are immune to be completely unbiased. It's actually might be a good thing to be biased sometimes, not racially though. I'm saying that sometimes our biases really help us get through our daily life. So for example, I can give you an example. So for example, if you find out that you're allergic to shrimp, right? And you probably gonna be biased towards lobster because maybe last time you had shrimp and you had a terrible allergic reaction. So this time you are thinking in your brain, well, I might not want to try the lobster because last time I had a terrible allergic reaction when I tried the shrimp, right? So sometimes biases are really mental shortcuts to help us avoid dangers in our daily lives. But when we live in a social environment that give us a lot of false information around racial stereotypes, then it can become a problem at the social level. Next, please. So before I jump onto talking more specifically about race and racism, I want to talk about the impact, right? Just now I talked about the goal should be really to minimize harm, right? And I just want to talk about the impact of racial discrimination and just kind of point to why we really want to avoid traumatization and re-traumatization. It is really, in my belief, and I also think that it is true, that the less racism and less racial discrimination that we have in our society is better for everyone. Ultimately, we want our society to be healthy and well, and creating an environment that is free of racial discrimination can be really healthy for everybody living in that specific environment. So so on the flip side, racism can have detrimental effect on many aspects of mental health. And here our focus is on Asian American adults, but also more generally for people who identify as people of color, racial discrimination can be also related to lower grades for adolescents, lower self-esteem, lower sense of belonging to American culture, less hope, lower life satisfaction, more physical complaints, increased level of depression and depressive symptoms, more anxiety, suicidal ideation, and overall distress. So, thank you. And, oops, you're good. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a survey that I helped put together at the organization that I worked for. So if you have been paying attention to the news, there has been a rise of anti-Asian hate in this country started around like before around the COVID-19, and so this last month, our organization wanted to get a sense of how common this kind of anti-Asian racism is in, I live in Philadelphia, so we wanted to find out how common it is in Philadelphia. And we surveyed 315 individuals, and during our vaccination events here in our community center. And out of the 315 individuals, we found that 1 in 7 of them have personally experienced an anti-Asian racism incident. And the most common form of racism incident that is experienced, including racial slur or name calling, with 63% of those said that they have experienced verbal assault, such as being called Chinese virus or asked to go back to China, regardless of whether they actually come from China or, of course, and any it doesn't really matter. They see an Asian face. That's what the perpetrator do, unfortunately. And I myself have experienced one incident when I was walking my dog in South Philly with my husband. I remember I was walking. It was in the evening, and we were walking our dog, and someone across the street yelled at us and asked us why we have our masks on. And he said something to the extent around that he was asking if we were Chinese, and so like he was saying something like, "Oh, you guys are Chinese, right? Why are you wearing your mask? You guys brought the virus here. You should take off your masks." And so I personally experienced it. My husband personally experienced it. I have a lot of friends who personally experienced it. So when we found the statistic that 1 in 7 have personally experienced such an incident, I actually wasn't too surprised, although it's pretty hard to swallow. This fact that this is so common is very scary. And the second most common form is physical intimidation, and followed by making it out as a joke, verbal threats, 12%, spitting, coughing, 5%. And similar to what other news reports have put out there, women are more likely than men to be victims of anti-Asian racism. Women are 13% more likely than men to be victims of anti-Asian racism. Next. And you might find these statistics pretty horrifying. I myself find it pretty horrifying. But unfortunately, this is only the tip of the iceberg. What do I mean? I think it is a good thing that people now start to pay attention to the racism that Asian Americans experience. But this is certainly not something new, and this is certainly not the only way that Asian Americans experience racism, more specifically. And I'm gonna talk about that next, please. Okay, and then now, before I talk about how Asian Americans experience racism, I want to take a step back to think about what is race. So please, next. So I have two questions for our participants. So the first one is, are we born with a race in the same way we are born with fingers, eyes, hair? In other words, racial categories natural? You can put it in the chat and I'll be reading. I'll give you guys a few minutes. And if you want to explain your answer, feel free to. If you just want to put a yes or no, that's fine too. I'm seeing the answers rolling in. It's a very controversial question. And I see almost as many yeses as nos. And I see a lot of people say that race is a social construct. And some people say, yes, maybe ancestry, skin color, yes and no, yes. It is very controversial. Okay, next, please. So the answer is no. It's not the same. We do not, well, the thing is that we do not come into this world as African or European or Asian, black or white. Rather, this world comes to us, if that makes sense. That, yes, we are born with hair, we are born with fingers, we are born with eyes. Sometimes when I teach this topic, it gets very confusing, right? Some people would say that, well, we can't choose our skin color. But then I would ask questions like, but why do we pick these seemingly ambiguous characteristics, physical characteristics, and put people in specific racial categories based on those characteristics, right? Why don't we pick how long our fingers are, and we determine whether we have long finger people and short fingers people? Why don't we pick shoe size, and we have large shoe size people and small shoe size people? Why don't we pick eye color, right? So we have blue eyed people and brown eyed people and, green eyed people. Why do we pick skin color? Why do we pick hair texture, right? And when it comes to Asians, why is it that our eyes or the shape of our eyes become a place or a specific characteristic that we want to zoom in on when we determine people's race? Right. And very often I use myself as an example because people would ask, what about ancestry? Right? You can't really pick your ancestry, right? If you look at me, and no offense, you you can all see that I'm Asian. I don't think anyone would doubt it, right? And usually I would ask this question in a classroom setting, and everybody would say, "Well, you're Asian," and but I am not entirely Asian. Actually, my father is from Nicaragua, so I'm partly Latinx, and I am also Asian. But because people see me as Asian, my Asian identity become more prominent. It shapes my life experience more intensely than my Latina component, right? And so if I did 23andMe DNA tests, and if you just look at my DNA, or you look at my grandmother's DNA, and we are all different things. But to the world, it doesn't matter. People look at my face, they think that I'm Asian, and I don't think is like I don't think people should feel guilty that they see race, because it's just our social reality, if that makes sense, right? It's like when we are young, we learn that um, I don't know, we learn about colors, we learn about alphabets, we learn about numbers, right? And we learn about race whether we want to or not. It is something that our society has taught us everywhere we go, just like how we learn about gender, about sex, right? About all these things. And so we see people in different racial categories. So going back to my question I asked, right? Is racial category natural? It is not natural. And in fact, if you look at the history of our census, the definition or the racial categories in which people are being classified has changed over time. So, for example, if you go way far back, right, Jewish were not seen as white. And if you go way, way, way far back, Irish people were not seen as white, right? So, those categories have changed based on our historical and political realities. And so fingers, eyes, and hair are natural, right? Whereas race is a social fabrication. All right, next. So what is race if race is socially constructed, right? So race is a symbolic category. Symbolic means that it has to do with symbol, it has to do with meanings. And we are all social beings. We want to make things meaningful to us, right? And it is based on phenotype, right? Our hair type, skin color, eye shape, okay, or ancestry, okay, in some cases, and it's constructed according to specific social and historical context, like I said, and that is misrecognized or wrongly recognized as a natural category. I'm just going to read it again. Race is a symbolic category based on phenotype or ancestry and constructed according to specific social and historical contexts that is misrecognized as a natural category. Next. So what is racism? We talked about race itself, right? So if race is socially constructed, then racism is based on a social construction, right? It is based on a historical creation, and I'm not saying that it doesn't really exist. Just because people create it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that it's not natural, right? Just because people created my iPhone doesn't mean that my iPhone is not real. It is real, okay? And for racism, usually in sociology, we understand these two big categories of racism. And we might have heard a lot of people talking about systemic racism and what is racism, right? And usually when people think about racism, they think about this bad person, this with bad intention who are out there to hurt people because they have hate inside them, right? Which is, like I said, the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what racism means, okay? And so we have institutional racism, or sometimes known as systemic racism. And systemic racism really shapes our social inequalities, as we can see in social institutions such as education, healthcare, the legal system, families, and the media. Okay, and we won't talk too much about that today. However, I can touch upon some of the ways in which Asian Americans also experience systemic racism, despite our experience being very different from, for example, Black Americans, because of the historical patterns in which Asian Americans came to the United States, and the way and our relationships with racism in the United States. And in terms of interpersonal racism, or sometimes known as individual racism, is the kind of racism that people usually think about when they think about racism. It involves personal attitudes, biases, prejudice, and discrimination. And like I said, we all have biases. So what are the differences between, people might ask, what are the differences between biases and prejudice, right? So biases happen when people make an assumption based on very little information. Okay, so and like I said, biases might doesn't have to be based on race. Okay, it can be based on anything. For example, if you had eaten an apple and you don't like the taste of apple and you stop eating any fruits, okay, that makes you very biased in terms of fruits. And that can happen when you apply this kind of biased logic when understanding race, right? You might have a bad experience with a person who belonged to a specific racial categories, and then you decided that that one bad experience is representative of all the people in that particular racial group. That's biases. Okay, prejudice is when you act upon the biases, right? So you might have that bad experience with a person of Asian descent, for example, and you decided that all Asian people are not friendly. So if you stop being friends with any Asian person, or if you are an employer, you decided that you're not going to hire any Asian people because you had one bad experience with an Asian person. Now that's prejudice. Okay, so when you act upon your biases, it becomes prejudice. So we know that we all have biases. We just need to watch them. Similarly, you might want to be more open-minded with your eating habits, right? You might had a bad apple experience. You don't want to stop eating all the fruits. Then you might end up not trying pineapples and bananas and all the other fruits. So it's the same kind of thing. It is important to check ourselves and kind of keep an open mind. All right, next. Okay, so when it comes to institutional or systemic racism, is a synonym, so you can use it interchangeably. And is systemic. Okay, is systemic white domination of people of color embedded and operating in corporations, universities, legal systems, political bodies, cultural lives, and other social collectives. So if you are a person, you basically cannot escape from this framework uh, because racism is everywhere when it comes to systemic racism in a country like the United States. It's informed by centuries of racial domination. Institutional racism withholds from people of color opportunities, privileges, and rights that many whites enjoy. And the word domination kind of reminds us that institutional racism is a type of power. Okay, and and people often talk about power. So what is power? There are different aspects of power. So we can think of power as a symbolic power. Symbolic power, again, symbols and meanings. And symbolic power is the power to classify one group of people as normal and the other group of people as abnormal, or one group of people as us, right, and the other group of people as other, right? And we also have political power. Political power includes power to withhold basic rights from certain groups of people, right? Or marshal the full power of the state to enforce segregation and inequalities and inequity, right? And we also have more soft power, such as social power, right? To deny certain people of full inclusion or not see them as fully American, or not including them in any associations or in your social circle, right? And lastly, we have economic power, right? And then I don't know if you've heard of the racial wealth gap, and and that refers to economic power with white folks who are having more privileges in terms of job placement, advancement, wealth, and property accumulation. And a lot of it is not based on one person's making one decision. It is many decisions being accumulated throughout many years in different institutions. And so it's very hard to change it. And if you look at the image that I'm showing, right, it sort of explains the difference between inequality versus equity versus justice, right? And if we're thinking about justice, we're really thinking about changing the institutional setting within which racism takes place, which might take many generations to change. But I'm personally quite hopeful. Next, please. Okay, so when it comes to interpersonal and individual racism, usually when I teach this kind of topics, people get more interested in the individual racism part because they feel like they have more agency, they have more power to change it, they can avoid it, there's something that they can do within their power to change it. I think all of the institutional parts and the individual parts are intertwined. It is hard to enact or change our own behavior if the environment doesn't really change. So I think it has to happen simultaneously. I don't have a specific answer for it. It's very complicated and there are a lot of moving parts. So in terms of interpersonal racism, it refers to racial domination that shows up in everyday interactions and practices, just everyday practices. And you might have heard of the distinction between the overt racism and the covert racism. It refers to the interpersonal racism. So overt is more direct and the kind of like very old school way of understanding what racism looks like, is that, like I said, that bad guy who's out there with hate in their hearts, very kind of direct in your face, very obvious, and such as verbal assault, right? The reports that I just showed you, 1 in 7, that belongs to the overt interpersonal racism. But like I said, it's just a small part of how racism function uh, in as an entirety. And then there are more covert interpersonal racism, which is more indirect, subtle. It's more like a habit. It's more like common sense and very ordinary practices of our lives. And very, very often is completely unintentional. Sometimes it can even be well intended, such as microaggression and implicit biases. And I'm going to tell you more specifically how Asian Americans experience those microaggression and what the long-term impact of being constantly living in an environment where we have to face these microaggressions day in and day out, right? And I think we can all work together to do better, so we live in a healthier society as a whole. Next. So that's the next part. How do Asian Americans experience racism and racial trauma? So there are a lot of misconception about Asians and anti-Asian racism. And I think the discourse, the public discourse is changing. However, for a very long time, although it was generally accepted that Black Americans experience both systemic and I even think that it was until last year we started to recognize that Black folks experience systemic racism, but not just this kind of individual racism, right? So, and interpersonal racism. On the other hand, many people view that Asian Americans experience little racism, because maybe of our lighter skin color, or really is based on the invisibility of Asian Americans in media and the US history, right? And I'll go from the top one where I said aggregate data often show that Asian Americans have somehow made it. If you look at the census level data, you would see that Asian Americans are doing very well in terms of academically and economically. Now, that kind of aggregate level data really ignores the fact that the diversity within the Asian population. Like I said, Asian Americans is a very, very diverse racial group. And based on our immigration trajectory, our social economic status and educational achievement look very, very different across different communities. If you single out the Vietnamese American experience, right? If you take out Vietnamese American and only look at the data for Vietnamese, and compare the educational level across different racial groups, Vietnamese Americans' data look more like Black folks and Latino folks than with other Asian folks, right? So if you compare Chinese, Vietnamese, Black, and Latino, you would see that Vietnamese, the data for Vietnamese look more similar to the data that reflect the Black and brown population. Okay, so there are more dissimilarities, there are more differences between Chinese and Vietnamese, right? But like I said, even within the Chinese community, there are so many differences, right? Based on the kind of different historical backgrounds and immigration stories that people have. For example, I can use my own example. For example, my husband come from a region called Fuzhou, and most Fuchownese in America came here during the 90s, and a significant number of Fuchownese came here as victims of human trafficking, and that's within the Chinese American experience. Now, compared to those who came from Hong Kong, who came from Hong Kong during, I would say, the 80s or maybe late 70s, or maybe some of them even 60s, right? Some of them really came to the United States with money. So they're bringing the capital that they have accumulated from Hong Kong to the United States, and they might use that money to open up their small businesses. Okay, they might have an entirely different American experience. So even within the Chinese population, even within Chinatown, okay, the very small Chinatown in Philadelphia, we see those divergence in terms of immigration experiences within the Chinese population, let alone all Asian Americans, right? But if you look at the aggregate data, you only see one story, that Asian Americans have made it, right? So very often we don't really hear the story of low-income Asian folks. We don't hear the story of Asian folks who are living in poverty, right? We don't hear the story of Asian folks who have trouble moving up in the path along the path of social mobility, right? And on top of that, you have the model minority stereotype, which is this myth, right? This misconception that Asian Americans have made it, that we are all doctors and lawyers, and we are kind of like trouble-free, uh, overachievers, right? Who might be apolitical and silent, right? So those kind of stereotype, and as you can see, are very prevalent and powerful in the media and representation in more mainstream media portrayal. And then you have the invisibility and the erasure of Asian Americans' history in U.S. history. Right now, I know some Asian Americans who are activists and advocates advocating for the mandatory Asian American studies or Asian Americans history being implemented in grade school, right? We don't normally hear those stories. We don't normally hear the war stories and immigrant stories of Asian Americans in the media or in history books. Next. So I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about the historical part. But I want to talk about microaggression first. But before I say anything about microaggression, I want to just remind everybody that these stereotypes, right, that have these biases that lived in our brain and in our muscle, right? They don't come from nowhere. They don't. They don't they're not we know that race is not natural. I hope everybody know that at this point, right? But these racial stereotypes generally comes from history, and I'm going to talk a little bit about history later, but I want you to bear in mind about this very kind of insidious and subtle linkage between our everyday practices that can be biased and prejudiced, and how it's really linked to past historical events. Okay, so let's talk about microaggression, because it's one of the most prevalent form of racial discrimination and racism that Asian Americans experience. So what is microaggression? Microaggressions are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental slights, snubs, or insults. It's called microaggressions because it's very small. Okay, whether it's intentional and unintentional, like I said, sometimes even well-intended, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely, right, upon their marginalized group membership. Okay, and the key word here is like just solely, right? You look at a person and you approach them differently solely based on their race or solely based on their gender, right? And to avoid that is very easy to me, actually. Well, maybe not so much for others, but then my main way of avoiding that is that I don't see a person and try to approach them differently based on their race. I just see that person as a full person. And it's easily said than done. I understand. But like people also get mad when they don't when people fail to see their race. It's very complicated, but we can talk more about that later. So microaggression may have a few here several impacts, right? It can invalidate the group identity or experiential reality of that person, okay, or persons, demean them on a personal or group level, communicate them they are lesser than human beings, suggest that they do not belong with the majority group, or threaten and intimidate and or relegate them to inferior status and treatment. Um, it it can look like bullying. It can look like somebody says something that makes a person feel like their experience are not validated, or an action that makes somebody feel like they are less. Meanwhile, I also want to highlight a point about microaggression. Microaggression might not be race-based. It can be based on other marginalized identities. So it can be gender-based, for example. It can be based on other things. For microaggression that's race-based, we can call it racial microaggressions. But however, it's largely popularized as something that's related to racism and discrimination. And therefore, usually when people hear microaggressions, they're thinking about race. It doesn't have to be race-based. And I see a question about how do you separate microaggression versus bullying. Bullying can be a form of microaggression. It can be a form of racial assault, okay? But again, microaggression is very subtle. Is again, the keyword is really that, the keyword really is that that person is targeted based solely, right? If we're talking about racial microaggression, that the person is being targeted solely because of their race, right? They experience this kind of, or they receive this kind of treatment solely based on their racial identity. I can also share my slide then, maybe it's my mistake that I make. So here I want to showcase some examples in which Asian Americans experience racial microaggression more specifically. The first one could be, so there are different themes in which we can kind of thematize how Asian Americans often experience racial microaggression. The first one is alien in our own land, right? So I myself, I identify as an Asian American, but I'm also an immigrant, right? So I actually came, I wasn't born in the United States, right? But because of the diversity of Asian Americans and the diversity of our generational status and differences, there are many Asian Americans who were born here, right? Who still get asked, like, where are you from, right? Or you speak really good English, right? Assuming that, so this alien in our own land kind of is linked to this stereotype we call the perpetual foreigner, that Asian Americans continue to be seen as foreigners in our own land, as aliens in our own land, right? No matter our generational status. Some Asian Americans, they are third generation, fourth generations. We've got Asian Americans in this country who came here before our white counterparts, right? If you look back in history. However, Asian Americans continued to be seen as foreigners, as not belonging to the United States, or as not being seen as American, right? So that's alien in own land. The other themes that in which Asian Americans often experience racial discrimination and racial microaggression, more specifically, is the ascription of intelligence, and that is linked to the racial stereotype of model minority, right? And the model minority has its own historical story. It was actually created as a political campaign during around the 60s and the 70s, right? Which coincided with, if you pay attention to, the historical timeline, which coincided with civil rights movement, as a tactic to say, hey, if Asian Americans can make it, so can Black folks, right? The model minority stereotype was born in a very specific historical moment to to um, to work to function in a very specific way. Okay, and we continue to see how these kind of stereotypes continue to manifest in everyday interaction when non-Asian folks ascribe this kind of intelligence to Asian Americans. And sometimes when I teach that, and people might say, "Hey, this is a good thing, right? You've got like positive stereotypes. People think that you are really smart. It's a good thing that people think that you're really smart." And I would say that there is no good stereotype. There is not a single positive stereotype. It just doesn't exist. Because what stereotype does is it flattens a person, right? It makes them less human, right? And in on the ground, it can be very detrimental to the person. For example, I remember I once talked to an Asian student, high school student, and I think that at that time they in the classroom everybody was getting back their SAT score, and he got a really high score for his SAT because he worked really hard. But then the teacher made a kind of casual comment and said that, well, your SAT score is really high. Of course, you're Asians, right? And then everybody just laughed, right? It doesn't, like, I guess from the teacher's perspective, it's not something big. It was just like kind of a joke, right? But it really hurt him because he said that this kind of ascription of intelligence that he has experienced all his life makes him unable to own his own success, makes him feel like all the achievements that he had earned himself are not his. So to him, his success is just his identity, is not something that he had worked hard for, right? And for those Asian students who might not be so good at math, because we're all humans, some of us are good at math, some of us are not good at math. It has nothing to do with race, okay? But for those who might not be good at math, they feel like they have failed their race, if that makes sense, that they are not, that they're not the good Asians. Okay, so it put a tremendous amount of pressure specifically on students when it comes to academic success. All right. So number 3, we have denial of racial reality. Sometimes I still hear that, like, oh, you guys are basically white, right? Or you don't experience racism, and sometimes it can look like the exclusion or the omission of the Asian experience in race dialogue, right? That we tend to see race and racism as a black and white issues. Then we are not being seen as someone who experienced racism, and sometimes it can be in a research study. And actually, if you look at most of the research around racial trauma is focused on Black and Latino, okay, or Latinx, right? It's very rare that we can find research that is specifically related to Asian Americans, let alone the intra-ethnic differences within Asian Americans, right? And the excuse is often that, oh, the Asian population is too small, is statistically insignificant, right? But just now I've shown you, we have 22 millions of us in the United States. If you look hard enough, we're not statistically insignificant, right? But this is this myth, right? I remember so many of you expressed that, oh, I feel so surprised. I didn't know that there were so many Asian Americans, because we are made to believe that there aren't many Asian Americans in the United States, right? It's not an accident, because it's the invisibilization, right? The process of making Asian Americans invisible, right? And then number 4, we have the exoticization of Asian American women. Asian American women are often seen as exotic, Oriental, like coming from the Far East, right? And the objectification of women, and which is very much tied to, if you look back at the Atlanta shooting back in May, many people talked about this fetishization of Asian women. And when we talk about the history later a little bit, we can see that there are deep historical context and deep historical roots in terms of why Asian Americans women are seen in this specific way and why it is harmful. Basically, objectification, similar to stereotype, is harmful because it flattens the person. Okay, it makes the person a thing, an object, right? But not humans. The difference between an object and a thing, I feel like I shouldn't need to elaborate, but unfortunately we do have to elaborate. Like that when we see people as objects and things, we see them as a resource, right, to be exploited or to use, right? Well, but when we see a person as a human, we see the different parts of that person as a human that can include our racial identity, our gender identity, our personality. I don't know, our zodiac sign. I'm pretty much big on zodiac sign. That's fine too. You don't see me as an Aries. You see me as an Asian woman. Like when we get to see the diversity within that person, we humanize them, right? And we don't objectify them. We don't put a stereotype or a label on them. Number 5, invalidation of interethnic difference. I kind of touched upon that, about the diversity within the Asian community, that Asian Americans are we're not a monolithic group, right? However, like I said, people look at my face, they don't think that, oh, my dad's family is from Nicaragua. So the people won't know. Like every time I tell people that, oh, my father is from Nicaragua, that's how I got my last name, people get so shocked because I don't look the way they expect me to be, right? So there are a lot of expectations, right? How I should look, or as it is linked to my ethnic identity, right? So an example here, I would say saying ni hao when you see an Asian. I get that a lot. Like I remember one time a person asked me, how do I say sorry in Japanese? I said, I said, well, I don't know Japanese, right? So there are a lot of assumption that's built to it. First of all, I am assumed that I'm Japanese. Secondly, even if I were a Japanese, right, I might not know how to speak Japanese, depends on my generation status. I know many Chinese people who don't speak Chinese, okay, who actually Chinese is not a language, who don't speak Mandarin, or who don't speak Cantonese, who don't know how to read or write Chinese. I myself, I came here when I was 19 years old, therefore I can speak Cantonese and Mandarin, and I can read and write Chinese. But that's rare, I would say. It's hard to find, okay? So yeah. And number 6, pathologizing of cultural values. And here we see a lot here in, like, even in the work I do around mental health, that for example, I think American culture puts a lot of value in speaking up, okay, or participating verbally, which can contradict with some of the traditional values in certain families, okay, and so those type of cultural practices or communication styles are not being seen as valuable, or are seen as being sick, right? For example, not saying I love you, not expressing love in a Western way is being seen as a pathology, right? Is also a way in which Asian Americans experience racial microaggression. And sometimes I even talk about food. I remember we talked about food in the beginning of the webinar, right? Sometimes I ask my students, like, would you pay $100 to go to have a French meal? Everybody said, yes, I would pay $100 to eat a French meal. Would you pay $100 to eat a fried rice in Chinatown? No, that's too expensive, right? And then I asked, like, why do we put cultural values on certain culture but not on other culture, right? Not because we are bad people, but we are social beings living in this historical moment in which we see that culture that are usually being associated as white, as good, as expensive, as valuable, right? Versus cultures, food, practices that are seen as being related to people of color as being less expensive, cheap, tacky, um, less valuable, and therefore people are not willing to pay as much money for this for that cultural experience, right? And number seven, second class citizen being ignored in the restaurant, being ignored by a teacher in the classroom. Um, and number eight, invisibility, right? Omission of Asians in the race dialogue. I just talked about it. Lack of media representation. I see that in the Oscars changing, things are changing, but it's slowly changing. But a lot of us growing up, we don't really have any role models. We can't really see ourselves. I once heard that you can't become what you can't see, right? So when you don't have that role model, like I look at my daughter, I look at my daughter, right? An Asian girl, she's 4 years old. Oh no, she just turned 5. So she'll be really mad at me if she knew that I said it wrong. But she's 5 now, okay. And I only hope that she can see more role models so she can imagine herself to be so many different things, right? And number nine, we have racialized sexism and sexualized racism. It sounds very academic-y because it is, but it basically means the intersection between racism and sexism. In plain term, it means that an Asian man might not experience racism the same way as an Asian woman because Asian women are being um, are we experience the world differently because of how the world is seeing us differently. For example, Asian men are often seen as unattractive or not sexy, or Asian women are being seen as bad drivers, or we are exotic, submissive, so on and so forth. And I have to say that unfortunately, I have experienced all nine of them all the time. I and it, it it makes me hard to talk about it. I actually took a long time for me to prepare this presentation because of how personal and how close I am, because I live this experience every day. I wish I don't have to, but I do, and it is not easy. And you try to ignore it, you try to push it to the side, right? But if all of these 9 points just happen to you all the time and bombard your life all the time, right, it's hard to ignore it. It starts with something small, just here and there, like people making comments, um, or you see people ignore you, you're not quite sure if it's racism or it's not, and you try not to think about it. People make a joke out of something that you do, or they ask you how to pronounce something in Chinese or Japanese, who knows what. It adds up. Okay. And I use this analogy to explain racial microaggression to my students is mosquito bites, right? If you have one mosquito bites, it doesn't really bother you. But if you have mosquitoes following you around all the time and you have mosquito bites all over your bodies all the time, that is a problem. Okay. It becomes very, very hard to just try not to see it, right? Yeah, that's all I have to say for this slide. Next, please. Oh, I forgot that I have the slide. Okay, just trying to be mindful of the time. Okay, just gonna be quick so I can leave some room for Q&A. Like I said, these microaggressions don't come from nowhere. These racial stereotypes don't come from nowhere. It's often linked to historical and geopolitical realities. So I'm just gonna be really quick. We can talk for months on this, which can be a course in itself. So Asian Americans have been seen as not fully American or perpetual foreigners ever since we arrived on the land of America. The exploitation of Chinese railroad workers. I actually, not long ago, I learned that my great-great-grandfather was a railroad worker in California, and then he moved back to China, and then now I'm here in America. So Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment camp, killing of Vincent Chin, COVID-19 related racism. If you've never heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act or Japanese internment camp or Vincent Chin, it's not an accident. People don't really talk about Asian American history. as U.S. history, right? But of course, all of you are aware of the COVID-19 related racism today. That's still happening today. Next. Oh. And here are just some images. I just want to make a connection between what's happening in real time and in real history, or in the external reality, with our public imagination of how we want to imagine Asian Americans. And things are slowly changing, but still. I realize I really want to leave some time for Q&A, so I want to be mindful. So let's get to the trauma part really quickly. So this is one of my favorite quotes around trauma. I'm just going to read it. Trauma decontextualized in a person looks like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family looks like family traits. Trauma in a people looks like culture, right? So when we think about people having a culture, what we don't see is what happened to them. Right. And racism is linked with microaggression, which has a negative impact on mental health. I've already said it. So it's linked to problems such as substance abuse, low self-concept, self-esteem, mental distress, depressive symptoms, participation in unhealthy behaviors or non-participation in healthy behaviors. And for Asian Americans, and at least from the ground and in the community, I see a lot of depression and anxiety, often shown in a way that is very hidden and not talked about because of how stigmatized mental health is in the Asian community, right? So I can talk more about the programs and just coming from the community, what we've learned. I run a program that works to destigmatize mental health in the Asian community in Philadelphia, and before we started the program, I wanted to make sure that I understand the community needs. So we did a survey. In case you don't know, I love doing surveys. I'm a sociologist, can't help it. So we found that a lot of the youth were facing family pressure, racism, poverty, even sexual abuse, which is rarely talked about in our community. For the parents, family pressure, death of loved ones, unemployment, and illnesses. That's around the beginning of COVID-19. We did that survey. And we run a youth program that became very successful. At the end, we were able to lower the participants' anxiety level and encourage healthy communication with their family. And on the left is just some artwork being done by them to think about their Asian American identity in conjunction with their mental health and their family dynamics, right? So this is the slide I really want to show you, which is the lessons from the community, which is my lesson from the community is really including everybody in the process, from program design to implementation, allowing people to define safe space for themselves, right? And drawing on the assets and strength that immigrants and Asian immigrants can provide for themselves in conjunction with mental health professionals. So instead of educating the community about what they need, we trust them to let us know what they need, and we kind of meet them where they are, which makes it more successful and which help people talk about mental health more easily. Okay, and so some things, how do we provide some things around like trauma-informed care? So first of all, we have to realize that it's very prevalent. Trauma is very prevalent among Asian Americans. We're not model minority. It's a myth. Okay, we're not all doctors and lawyers. This is a problem in our community. Is a huge problem. And next step is to recognize how trauma affects all individuals involved, right? In your organization, in your program, in your institution, right? And then to put the knowledge into practice. And since you're all here today, I hope that you're recognizing the problem, you're realizing the problem. So I'll leave the rest of the time for you. But a question that I want to leave for you is, how will you put the knowledge that you've learned today into the practice, your practice at your work? Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, so much virtual applause for Dr. Esther and that wonderful presentation. We're going to enter now into the Q&A, and I have the distinct pleasure to be your moderator. I just wanted to sort of highlight some of the key information that you shared with us. There was so much packed in to that presentation. But one thing I want to highlight for the audience is the fact of the way in which racial trauma is embedded through compound stressors, right? You talked about overt personal racism that Asian Americans are experiencing, in addition to covert racism as exemplified by microaggressions, in addition to institutional and systemic racism. And I think that was no more evident the way in which those compound stressors come together to be so much of a heavy burden than as you went down that list and actually shared with us how you've experienced all of those different types of racial traumas in your daily life. I think the other thing I wanted to highlight as we move into audience questions is the myth of the model minority. The model minority was created as a tool of white supremacy. Our president last night said that white supremacy is an act of terrorism. And that is something that we have to confront in American society today. And I think your presentation highlighted that for us, the way in which we think about this as partners in systems of care and working across building up youth and families. Part of our charge is to dismantle terrorism, to dismantle that in our world. And a part of that is dismantling white supremacy and dismantling the myth of the model minority. And, lastly, you mentioned something as well as being a mother. And I thought we might start with the first question as we lead into our audience questions is, how do you as a mother, but also a practitioner that works with youth across your community, how do you have these difficult conversations about the rise in hate crimes towards your community with children?
Thank you for your question. It is a very, very hard question. It's easy to think about it abstractly than to practice it, actually talking to my daughter about it. I think the really first step that I had a race talk with my daughter, I started very, very early. I think I had the first race talk with her when she was only 3 years old. And I think our first race talk, it doesn't have to be super heavy. It's an ongoing thing. It's not the talk where you just sit her down and then that's it, right? But the first time I talked to her about race is really to talk about that people who have different races and to point it out. Like, for example, we are Asian, right? Your friend Juniper is white. Your friend Rasir is black, and it really helps her, right? And really, I think the most helpful way in which I help my daughter to think about the racial landscape of our society is and to dismantle dismantle white supremacy and dismantle this terrorism is by exposing her to people of different races. I know it sounds so cliche, but it's so crucial. If you think about that, we are constantly being bombarded by messages that are biased, right? That are communicating misconception around people of different races. Nothing is better than when you have real case scenario, real life experience that tell the child that this is just not true, right? Because that's not what I personally experienced, right? And so I think that's the number one thing that I do is instead of saying that people are all equal, well, we hope that is true, but unfortunately it is not true. So it's important to show the child that people indeed have different races. I think that's the first step.
Thank you so much for that answer and for sharing your insight and just your personal experience about having these really difficult conversations, but what, given everything you've shared today, are needed conversations. These are safety conversations, even, for children as young as you said, as 3 years old. Relatedly to children, there was an audience question, a few that came in, asking if you could particularly speak to the impact of adoption on Asian children by white parents. And relatedly, a second question was, someone asked, I'm from Korea. I came to the United States at the age of 5 months old. I was adopted by white parents. Am I Asian American? So where do I fit in the broader community?
Thank you for your question. For the second part of the question, I cannot answer for you because this is your own journey. You have to discover for yourself, right? But if we understand that race is what the world has given us, whether or not you see yourself as Asian American, it doesn't stop the world from seeing you as an Asian American person, if that makes sense, because race is marked, right? It's marked by other people. It's not something that we can choose to disclose or not, right? Ethnicity, on the other hand, you can choose to disclose or not. I don't have to tell you that I'm Chinese, right? But then you would tell me that I'm Asian. I don't get to choose whether I want to be an Asian person. And for the first part of the question, I lost the first part of the question. Can you repeat it?
Yes, the first part was around the experience of or impacts of adoption on Asian American children or Asian children by white parents. I forget the actual term for, there's a new term outside of mixed race
Transracial
adoption.
adoptee.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Transracial adoption.
Yeah. So I don't have a personal experience to speak directly on that, but what I've heard from a lot of transracial adoptees is the lack of space to talk about race in their own family, and that is harmful. And if we have any families who have adopted Asian children among the audience, I strongly advise you to create that safe space for your child or your children to talk about race, despite it being difficult, because the silence is more harmful than to actually have that difficult conversation. Maybe you're running away from it. You think it might hurt, it might be hurtful, but not talking about it is actually more hurtful.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. We're relatedly transitioning to how do you call people in when maybe they've made a cultural hiccup. We had a question that says, how do you address racism with a friend or acquaintance when the person has experienced severe traumatic events by a person of a certain race, and you don't want to invalidate that trauma, but you still need to address their bias? How would you recommend they interact or start that conversation?
Mm-hmm. I'm specifically thinking about having that conversation with my black friend. My best friend is a black woman, and I remember during last year there was a lot of tension within the Black and Asian communities around summertime, and we had that difficult conversation. And I think what came out of it as a lesson is that we have to hold our multiple truths and not invalidate one another, right? And what's helpful for me is to talk about my own experience without making any accusation of the other community, if that makes sense. And I remember talking about Black Asian solidarity building, and there was this hope from each side that we want each other to do more. But I think what is lost in that conversation is that we forgot that sometimes we just have to give before we take. So I realized the power of doing and giving if this is a common goal that we are all moving towards, right? It doesn't matter who gives first, you know. And if we focus so much on, oh, I need to receive something before I give, then we're not really focusing on the right path. If I answered your question. So how do we call people in? I think it is good to focus on your feeling. If there's hurt feeling, I think we should talk about it. We should express it. We should not feel ashamed of our feelings, and we can explore why we feel hurt without invalidating the other person who might come from another marginalized group.
I think that's fantastic advice. And it's always such a pleasure to speak with you because you bring this sort of back to your own personal experience, which I think so many folks can can learn from and are learning from in real time. I hope it's okay that maybe we take one or two more questions if you're okay time-wise, and then we'll round out for those that are attending right now. So there's a few questions that have come in about microaggressions. And so one of the questions relates to what other types of microaggressions may exist outside of racial microaggressions? And relatedly, is bullying a microaggression, or how do those two relate to each other?
Thank you for the question. So yes, in short, microaggressions can be based on other marginalized identity, most often can be related to gender. Okay, so women can experience microaggression in ways that men often do not experience. For example, being assumed that we're bad drivers, or when we speak too loud, we're seen as angry, or we talk too loud, right? And sometimes it can be based on sexual orientation or gender representation or gender expression, basically any, or immigrant status, right? People who are immigrants are being seen as less educated, or people who have an accent speaking English are being seen as less intelligent, right? But in fact, intelligence has nothing to do with your accent. So yeah, it comes in all different forms, and we, based on your identity, you can experience microaggression intersectionally. So for me, I'm a woman, I'm an immigrant, and I am a Asian person. So I, unfortunately, I do experience a lot of microaggressions coming from all these different sources. And in terms of bullying, yes, microaggression is a form of bullying. And what is the difference between it? Again, I think I sort of answered that before, is that microaggression is based solely upon that person's marginalized identity. So bullying can be based on other things, but usually a lot of bullying is based on marginalized identity. May it be age group, a different age group, or people who are seen as other. So they, in a way, they're very similar, but for racial, microaggression is specifically based on race.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Well, I think we have one question that there were so many questions that came in, and maybe we'll be able to share those with you and use it as a point for our collective growth and something for us as the PA partnership to further explore with some additional sessions. For those that are listening in, I know that our team will probably share this, but Dr. Esther will be back with us. So we're looking forward to that. But as we close out, there's one remaining question that I think is also very hopeful and future oriented. So I wanted to share that with you. One of the attendees mentioned that as a Latina mother of children who identify as Asian, Latino, and American, but whose features are mostly East Asian, what are some things that would be helpful for our family to engage in to educate ourselves and empower our children to celebrate the intersectionality of who they are? And you also mentioned this intersectionality quite frequently in your presentation.
Yes, I personally share a lot of different children's books written by authors who are identify as Latinx or Chinese or Asian, and I start a conversation from there. And again, it's linked to your first question about where do we start the race talk. Well, we start talking about it by identifying that we are indeed of different race. And personally, I do a lot of self-reflection. I personally have collected a lot of family stories, and I write about them. And it personally speaking, it has really helped me in terms of reflecting my own racial identity and gender identity, how all these identities have helped shape who I am and how I engage with the world. And it is genuine, it's very healing for me. For me, creativity is very important to me. I can't imagine living without it. I think everybody has different coping mechanisms and things that they enjoy. I would say that make it something that you like, don't see it as a chore. I really love talking about my identities and my journey and my family story with my children. I mean, my children and my family. It's just a great thing to do.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I think, even in your presentation, the work that you've done with community members and youth in particular, to use art as a healing-based trauma-informed practice has obviously been so transformational for the folks that you've worked with. You've experienced it individually, and I hope it's something that our audience will take away as a hopeful action for the future. So thank you so much to Dr. Esther. I'll turn it back over to our team for our closing remarks.
Thank you.
I'd like to say again, thank you, Dr. Castillo, for this presentation and speaking about the importance of sort of just being aware of, you know, the things that other people may be going through. I think sometimes we go through life not looking at how our actions may affect others and bringing some light to those things, I think is always a good thing. As a reminder to those seeking continuing education credits, use the link in the email you received today that will take you to a PDF with instructions for credits from UPMC. For those attending on Zoom, you will be prompted after the meeting today to throw in through an email tomorrow to participate in a brief survey about the presentation and download your certificate of attendance. This is separate from continuing education credits. I really want to stress that. So the link for the evaluation and the certificate of attendance is also included in the email you received today as for a reminder of the webinar. Our next presentation will be May 11th, 2021, starting at 2 p.m. And it will be presented by the Heroes Initiative, and they will be focusing on engaging youth and families through pop culture. Have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you again, Dr. Castillo, and have a good night, everyone.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Castillo. And as a reminder to what Kelsey tells us, yes, she is going to be back with us in July. We should have a firm date and information going out to you within the next couple of weeks. We look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a fantastic day.